I remember how often U.S.-Canada relations were described inside government as something close to automatic, a background condition rather than a policy choice. We shared intelligence without drama, traded more with each other than with almost any other partner, and treated the northern border as proof that democracy could coexist with power without friction. That assumption is why the latest aluminum trade move landed as a shock in public life, even though it shouldn't have surprised anyone paying attention to how power has been changing. Trade actions like this do not emerge out of nowhere. They are the product of authorities deliberately left vague, norms gradually weakened, and political incentives that reward confrontation over stewardship. When the United States invokes emergency or national security tools to restrict aluminum imports from Canada, it is not just making an economic argument. It is signaling that alliances are now conditional, transactional, and subordinate to domestic political needs. I have seen how quickly language inside government shifts from cooperation to justification, how words like temporary and necessary are used to make extraordinary measures sound routine. What makes this moment different is not the metal itself. Aluminum has been a flashpoint before, especially after 2018, when tariffs were imposed on close allies under the banner of national security. What is different is the cumulative effect. Each repetition trains institutions, markets, and voters to accept friction as normal. The rule-based order that once governed trade disputes quietly gives way to executive discretion, and democratic partners are treated less like allies and more like leverage. Media coverage often mirrors this distortion. The move is framed as toughness, as evidence of resolve, rather than as a stress test of democratic trust. That framing matters because it obscures the real cost. When rules are bent for convenience, institutions absorb the damage first. When allies are surprised on purpose, trust erodes by design. This was not supposed to happen between two democracies so deeply intertwined. But it did, because the system now rewards those who act as if nothing fundamental is at stake. In moments like this, the shock is not the decision itself. The shock is how prepared we have become to accept it. I learned early in government that the most durable alliances are not built on affection or shared rhetoric, but on law. The relationship between the United States and Canada has always been held together by treaties, dispute panels, and dense regulatory cooperation, not by sentimentality. That distinction matters now, because when law is treated as optional, even the closest partnerships begin to fray. For decades, trade integration between the two countries was designed to reduce discretion and elevate predictability. From the post-war period through the original U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement and later NAFTA, the logic was institutional. Rules would outlast administrations, disputes would be resolved through agreed mechanisms, not public threats. The system assumed good faith, but it did not rely on it. It relied on process. That design reflected a hard-earned democratic insight. Power behaves better when it is constrained. The shift we are witnessing today is a move away from that discipline. When trade actions bypass or undermine established dispute settlement systems, the damage is not merely economic. It is institutional. Executive authority expands, legislative oversight fades, and the idea that rules apply equally to friends and rivals begins to erode. I have watched how easily this shift is justified internally, framed as efficiency or necessity, even as it hollows out the very structures that made cooperation possible. Canada's reliance on law rather than leverage has long been a feature of the relationship, not a weakness. It reflects a commitment to predictability over power politics. But that commitment only works when both sides respect the same boundaries. When one partner treats legal frameworks as obstacles rather than guardrails, asymmetry replaces trust. Media narratives often miss this entirely. The story becomes one of personalities or posturing rather than institutional choice. But what is really at stake is whether democratic alliances can survive a world where law is subordinated to impulse. An alliance built on rules can withstand disagreement. An alliance reduced to sentiment cannot survive repeated breaches. This moment reveals how fragile even the strongest legal architectures become when norms are no longer defended. The law still exists. The question is whether power still feels bound by it. I have watched the phrase national security evolve from a solemn responsibility into a political solvent. capable of dissolving almost any constraint placed on executive power. Originally, these authorities were designed for moments of genuine peril, when the democratic process had to move faster than usual to protect the country. What has changed is not the law itself, but how casually it is now deployed, especially in economic life. When aluminum trade actions are justified on national security grounds, the argument is not really about supply chains in a time of war. It is about bypassing the friction of democratic governance. These tools allow administrations to act without prolonged congressional debate, without waiting for international adjudication, and without fully accounting for allied impact. Inside government, this is often framed as pragmatism. In reality, it is a reallocation of power away from institutions and toward impulse. This transformation did not happen overnight. After September 11, emergency authorities expanded dramatically, and the political culture learned to defer. After the 2008 financial crisis, economic stability itself became securitized, treated as something too fragile for democratic delay. By the time trade policy absorbed this logic, the guardrails were already weakened. Declaring an economic issue a security issue became the fastest way to silence objections. The democratic consequence is profound. When everything is secure, nothing is accountable. Courts hesitate, legislators retreat, and allies are left arguing with justifications rather than policies. Canada, a country whose aluminum industry is deeply integrated with the U.S. defense and manufacturing, suddenly finds itself rhetorically reclassified from partner to potential threat. That linguistic shift does real damage. It trains the public to accept suspicion where cooperation once lived. Media incentives accelerate this process. National security framing discourages nuance and rewards certainty. Questioning the premise becomes suspect, even when the facts do not support it. Over time, the public learns to associate decisiveness with strength and legality with weakness. What we are witnessing is not simply a trade dispute. It is the normalization of exceptional power in ordinary economic life. Once that door is opened, it rarely closes on its own. I have seen how foreign policy decisions are often explained as strategic when they are in truth deeply domestic. Trade disputes with Canada are a clear example of how internal political incentives now spill across borders with little restraint. What looks like a hard line abroad is frequently a performance for voters at home. In the United States, aluminum policy is shaped less by continental economics than by electoral geography. Industries concentrated in a handful of states wield outsized influence, and trade actions become a way to signal loyalty to workers who feel ignored by globalization. That pressure is real, but the response has shifted. Instead of addressing structural dislocation through industrial policy or labor investment, administrations increasingly reach for tariffs and restrictions that deliver immediate political optics. The damage, meanwhile, is exported. Congress is formally empowered over trade, but in practice, it has ceded ground. Emergency authorities allow presidents to act first and explain later, and legislators often hesitate to intervene when the politics are uncomfortable. I watched this pattern harden after the financial crisis, when fear of market reaction discouraged democratic friction. Over time, that hesitation became a habit. Domestic politics began driving international consequences without meaningful institutional debate. Canada becomes collateral in this arrangement. Its industries are tightly interwoven with U.S. supply chains, yet it has no vote in American elections. That imbalance makes it an easy target for symbolic action. The result is a policy environment where allies absorb the costs of U.S. political dysfunction, while the benefits are claimed domestically as proof of resolve. Media coverage reinforces the cycle. Trade moves are framed as standing up for our workers, a phrase that rarely interrogates whose jobs are actually affected or how integrated production has become. Complexity is flattened into slogans, and cross-border harm is rendered invisible. The audience is taught to see retaliation as consequence-free and compromise as surrender. This is how democratic erosion works in practice. Not through a single reckless decision, but through repeated choices that privilege short-term political survival over long-term institutional health. Domestic politics do not stop at the water's edge anymore. They crash straight through it, leaving allies to manage the aftermath. I have spent enough years inside newsrooms to know that the media does not just reflect political reality. It organizes it. In moments like this, when trade disputes harden into public conflict, the dominant narratives matter as much as the policies themselves. And too often, those narratives reward the illusion of toughness over the substance of democratic responsibility. Trade actions against allies are frequently framed as evidence of strength, clarity, and resolve. The language is familiar, standing firm, drawing lines, sending messages. What gets lost is the distinction between strength that is performative and strength that is institutional. It takes far less effort to impose a tariff than to sustain a rules-based system that constrains power over time. But only the former delivers immediate drama. Television thrives on conflict that can be reduced to winners and losers. A complex dispute over aluminum supply chains, energy integration, and treaty obligations does not fit neatly into a segment, so it is simplified. Canada becomes an abstraction. Law becomes a footnote. The audience is invited to cheer decisiveness without being asked to consider cost. I have watched this dynamic up close, how quickly nuance is crowded out by certainty. This framing has consequences. When toughness is defined as unilateral action, democratic accountability looks weak by comparison. Legal challenges appear slow. Negotiation appears timid. The public is conditioned to associate compromise with failure, even when compromise is how alliances survive. Over time, media incentives align with political ones, amplifying escalation and muting restraint. The illusion is powerful because it feels satisfying, but it is also corrosive. It teaches citizens to evaluate leadership by posture rather than outcomes, by tone rather than durability. The real work of governance, especially among democracies, happens in process, not performance. That work rarely makes for compelling television. What worries me most is how normalized this has become. The media does not need to invent outrage. It merely has to reward it. And in doing so, it participates in the quiet erosion of trust between democratic partners. Toughness, when stripped of context, becomes a substitute for judgment. In the long run, democracies do not fail because they are too restrained. They fail when restraint is no longer understood as strength. When trade conflict flares between democracies, the most revealing responses are often the least theatrical. Canada's reaction to the U.S. aluminum measures is not built for cable news. It unfolds through legal filings, calibrated countermeasures, and appeals to institutions that were designed precisely for moments like this. That choice is deliberate, and it is also a stress test. I've seen how governments that believe in rules behave under pressure. They document, they invoke treaty language, they prepare retaliation that is proportional, targeted, and legally defensible. Canada's approach reflects a confidence in process, even when the process feels painfully slow. It assumes that legitimacy still matters, that facts still carry weight, and that democratic partners can be compelled to explain themselves. But this strategy exposes a vulnerability. Rules-based systems depend on reciprocity. When one party stretches or ignores constraints, the burden shifts onto the one still playing by them. Quiet retaliation may be morally sound, but it is politically asymmetrical. Tariffs announced with a press conference dominate the news cycle. Legal challenges filed months later rarely do. Inside institutions, this imbalance is deeply felt. Dispute panels are activated, consultations are scheduled, timelines stretch. Meanwhile, markets adapt and damage becomes normalized. What was meant to deter escalation risks is being absorbed as the new baseline. I have watched this happen in other contexts, where adherence to process becomes mistaken for acquiescence. Media incentives compound the problem. The absence of spectacle is misread as weakness. Retaliation that is careful and lawful is portrayed as timid, even though it reflects democratic maturity. The public is rarely invited to see institutions at work, only to notice when they appear to fail. This is the quiet crisis at the heart of the moment. The system is functioning, but under strain. Each episode tests whether law can still discipline power or whether power has learned how to outpace accountability. Canada's response keeps faith with the rules. The question is whether the rules are still strong enough to hold. Institutional endurance has always depended on shared commitment. When that commitment wavers, even the most carefully designed systems begin to creak. I have learned that trust, once damaged, rarely returns on the same timeline as policy. Tariffs can be lifted with a signature, statements can be walked back, but the memory of being treated as expendable lingers, especially among allies who built their economic and political systems around predictability. That is the quiet aftermath of moments like this. Repeated trade shocks train governments and industries to plan for volatility, even when agreements remain on paper. Canadian firms begin diversifying away from U.S. exposure. Policymakers recalibrate assumptions about reliability. None of this happens with fanfare, but all of it reshapes the relationship. An alliance that once felt structurally secure starts to feel conditional, dependent on the mood of domestic politics rather than shared rules. The democratic consequence extends beyond bilateral trade. When the United States treats a close democratic partner as a lever rather than a collaborator, it sends a signal to the rest of the world. Rules appear flexible, commitments appear negotiable. Authoritarian systems notice this quickly. They do not need to outcompete democratic institutions. They only need to wait for democracies to weaken their own. Media narratives rarely linger on this long view. The reversal of a tariff is treated as a resolution, as if the story ends there. But trust does not reset with policy. It erodes cumulatively, shaped by patterns rather than single acts. I have seen how institutions absorb these patterns quietly, adjusting expectations downward in order to survive. What troubles me most is how normalized this erosion has become. Democratic alliances are being tested not by external enemies, but by internal impatience with restraint. Power is exercised as if credibility were infinite, as if trust were a renewable resource. It is not. The lesson of this moment is not about aluminum. It is about democratic stewardship. Alliances endure when leaders understand that law is not a burden but a shield, that restraint is not weakness, and that trust is the most fragile form of power we possess. Once it is spent, no trade agreement can buy it back.